All right. Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Dagmawi Wubshet. I am the Ahuja Family Presidential Associate Professor of English and a Center for Africana Studies faculty affiliate here at the University of Pennsylvania. Welcome to the first program in our spring 2022 Africa Lecture Series, which highlights the most vibrant and current scholarship in Africana studies, in African studies in particular. So it is my great pleasure this evening to introduce our speaker, Professor Daniel Agbiboa, who will present a talk entitled Deprovincializing the Police Towards a Transnational Solidarity Against Brutality. Now, Professor Agbiboa is Assistant Professor of African and African American Studies at Harvard University and a member of the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton. He holds his PhD from the University of Oxford and an MPhil from the University of Cambridge. His research interests focus on the relationship between state and non-state actors in urban Africa. Professor Agbiboa is the author of several books, including They Eat Our Sweat. What a great title, by the way. They Eat Our Sweat, Transport Labor, Corruption, and Everyday Survival in Urban Nigeria, published by Oxford University Press this year. And Mobility, another monograph titled Mobility, Mobilization, and Counterinsurgency, The Roots of Terror in an African Context, also published 2022 from Michigan University Press. Let me just remind our audience that following the lecture, we will have time. Professor Agbiboa will answer questions from the audience. So feel free to type in your questions in the Q&A box at any time during his presentation. Please, again, a warm welcome. Help me join welcoming Professor Daniel Agbiboa.
Thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you to the Center for having me. It's a real pleasure to be here and to present this paper that is very much a work in progress, maybe a work in its infancy, I would say. So your comments are very much welcome. I'll go ahead and share my screen. I can't breathe. These were the three dying words of 42-year-old African-American man, George Perry Floyd Jr., as his life was snuffed out under the knee of now former Minneapolis officer Derek Chauvin. Floyd was arrested after a store clerk suspected him of using a counterfeit $20 bill and alerted the police. His slow, excruciating end on May 25, 2020, caught on camera by bystander, provoked massive protest that spilled over into cities across the United States and reignited uneasy questions about the intersectionality of police brutality and anti-Black racism. The 9 minutes and 29-second video of Floyd's murder sent shockwaves through the globe, generating unprecedented scrutiny, and nowhere as critically as from the African continent. Africa-based protests in solidarity with Black Lives Matter movement were matched with strong statements by African leaders, including the chairperson of the African Union, condemning Floyd's murder and urging the UN to end all forms of discrimination. A letter signed by all 54 African nations called on the UN Human Rights Council to urgently debate police brutality and systemic racism. The African support for Black Lives Matter was not just embodied, but also divine. In Benin Republic, that West African country famous for being the birthplace of voodoo, priests, priestesses, and diviners undertook a revenge ritual, invoking Gugbadagli, the god of war and iron, to empower Floyd to rise in the spiritual world and to mete out justice on his own behalf. But as the saying goes, when you point a finger, there are three fingers pointing back at you. How can we express outrage over the death of Floyd, some Africans pointedly ask, but stay eerily silent on the brazen killings of ordinary Africans by our own police? Others note that Black lives matter everywhere that Black lives are found, whether in the Twin Cities or in Kinshasa. While enforcing COVID-related lockdown measures and cordon sanitaires in 2020, police institutions across Africa killed no less than 20 people in Kenya, 18 in Nigeria, 12 in Uganda, and 10 in South Africa. We must start caring about the lives of Black people here in Africa first, said Julius Malema, a politician and activist in South Africa, that rainbow nation which has itself grappled with police brutality and xenophobic violence against immigrants from elsewhere on the continent. When you kill Zimbabweans, Nigerians, and Mozambicans here in South Africa, he added, you are teaching the world that it is okay to kill Black people. Africa did not have to wait too long after Floyd's murder to face its own reckoning with police brutality. On October 3, 2020, exactly 131 days later, Africa's most populous nation, Nigeria, was wobbled by a massive youth-led campaign against police brutality. Under the rallying hashtag #EndSARS, the Sorosoke or Speak Up generation, as young protesters styled themselves, demanded to see the back of the Special Anti-Robbery Squad or SARS, an elite unit of the Nigerian police force originally formed in 1992 to address violent crimes and rising cases of armed robbery. Their voice belied the long-held criticism that Nigerians lack the spirit of rising up and saying no, and would rather endure the everyday kick and slap of the police and army. The rise of the Sorosoke generation called that docile subjectivity into question. It signaled the readiness of Nigeria's post-millennials to not merely challenge police brutality, but to renegotiate their place in dominant patterns of authority and control through the instrumentality of technosocial practices. Sorosoke became Nigeria's I Can't Breathe, and EndSARS became that country's Black Lives Matter. The immediate catalyst for EndSARS was an October 3, 2020 viral video that appeared to show the unprovoked killing of an unknown young man by SARS officers during a stop and frisk operation in Ughelli, Delta State. After which, the officers made away with that young man's SUV, leaving his ravaged corpse by the roadside. Soon after, another video surfaced on Twitter showing SARS officers killing 20-year-old up-and-coming musician Daniel Chibuike, fondly known as Slick, just outside a supermarket in Port Harcourt. Nigerians had finally seen enough. On the one hand, the unknown SARS officers involved in the aforementioned killings reveal the blue wall of silence that has long marked the Nigerian police as a total institution after Irving Goffman. On the other hand, the unknown identity of the young man from Ughelli symbolizes the veil of anonymity that shrouds many victims of police brutality in Nigeria. These lyrics from Fela's 1981 album, Unknown Soldier, rings true today. Nigeria is a known place where we get unknown police, we get unknown soldier, we get unknown civilian, all is equal to unknown government. The casual snuffing out of Black lives by the police in Nigeria and the US offers a stark reminder of the proximity of Black lives to non-being and Black death to non-event. It is this non-being and non-event of Blackness that inspired major movements such as Negritude and Pan-Africanism, with their rallying cry of Black consciousness and Black political solidarity. These movements are today born again in performative assemblies such as Black Lives Matter and EndSARS, which strive to show us that police brutality is not inevitable, even if non-reformist reforms or transformative reforms can sometimes feel impossible. The police are neither revolutionaries nor change makers. Their forte lies in speaking the languages of stateness, languages that resist confinement within the limits of statehood. The raison d'etre of police work is to preserve the social order and to quell any form of dissent. Policing is about keeping the so-called dangerous classes in place and in their place, by reminding them that some humans are more equal than others. The global motto of the police, to protect and to serve, lacks any specificity, precisely because the domain which the police truly protect and serves, the state and capitalism, is ubiquitous yet elusive. Despite our unavoidable tendency to predicate the state with a definite article there, what we call the state is hardly a uniform, cohesive entity. It is certainly not reducible to Max Weber's belabored definition of the state as the monopoly of violence within a given territory. In perhaps the most sophisticated theorization, Timothy Mitchell defines the state as simultaneously real and illusory, as material force and ideological construct. He invites us to pay close attention to the interaction between the state's material reality and its ideal appearance. The state, he argues, produces ambivalent effects that are practical yet ghost-like. The ambivalent effects of the phantom state are globally observable in the blood boundaries of the state in contemporary India, in the present absence of the state in the marginal barrios of Cochabamba city in Bolivia, in the imaginary lines that mark the space of the checkpoint in occupied Palestine, in the emptiness of the refurbished dispensary in rural Niger that reminds citizens of the there-ness of the state and of its regime of pretense, in the anticipation of violence that constitutes the checkpoint in Sri Lanka, and in the post-colonial state in Nigeria, which is highly present in its apparent absence. Like the state whose insignia they bear, the police are part of a world where the real and the imaginary are interchangeable. That is to say, the act of policing summons the power and authority of the state into being, rendering its ambivalent effect palpable and perceptible to the public eye. 50-odd years ago, American playwright James Baldwin wrote that police in the US are present to keep the Negro in his place and to protect white business interests, and they have no other function. A decade later, Frantz Fanon would describe the colonial police in Africa as the instituted go-betweens who navigate a quote-unquote world cut in two. As agents of empire, Fanon notes that the police are the bringers of violence into the workaday world of the native. Through these words, Baldwin and Fanon invite us into the origins of modern policing in political economy. By and large, the template of modern policing in America came through the slave patrols in the antebellum South from 1700 through 1865. Slave patrollers were generally white propertied men who joined forces with poor white to stop slave revolts and to instill the fear of escape. Perched atop horses and armed with whips and guns, these patrolmen watched, waylaid, and whipped black slaves, evoking memories of the Posse Comitatus, the bands of men called out in early modern England to hunt down and arrest fleeing felons. The observable hunting mentality of American policing today is traceable to this era. After the Civil War and the passage of the 13th Amendment in 1865, slave patrols gave way to racially focused militias empowered to enforce black codes, laws designed to limit the mobility of newly freed black slaves and to maintain their status as a cheap and docile workforce. Key to these black codes were vagrancy laws, which meant that masterless blacks could be arrested and enslaved. That in mind, it is easy, but no less hard to see why in 2021, Black people make up 27% of those killed by police, despite being only 13% of the population. A key lesson of modern campaigns, from Lyndon Johnson's war on crime to Richard Nixon's war on drugs, is that police brutality is as much about the past as about histories of the present. The past is layered and reinscribed in new ways within the present. In Nigeria, on the other hand, modern policing is traceable to 1861, when the British colonial state set up a native police force, or NAP, to do its imperialistic bidding. The NAP was the feared alien trusted to fall into line with colonial orders and out of line with the Vox Populi. Chosen from the so-called martial races, NAP recruits had nothing to do with serving the in common. Their overriding mission was to defend the interests of the metropole by safeguarding white-owned property, disciplining labor, and crushing indigenous resistance to colonial rule. The latter shines through in the Aba Women's War of 1929, when colonial police forces opened fire on a multitude of women from Southeast Nigeria, killing at least 50 on the spot. The women were revolting against an order by the British state to tax women already in extremis amidst the Great Depression. As one Aba woman points out, and I quote, "Our men are in trouble already, and we women are going to be taxed. The situation will be unbearable." 2 decades later, colonial police officers fatally shot 21 striking coal miners who were demanding better working conditions at the Iva Valley coal mine in Southeast Nigeria. That massacre bore a striking resemblance to the Latimer massacre of 1897 that occurred here in Pennsylvania, when the police shot and killed 25 immigrant coal miners from Eastern Europe who were protesting for equal pay and better working conditions. Many of them were shot in the back as they fled. And of course, some of us would remember the Americana Massacre in 2012, when the South African Police Service shot dead 34 miners during a wildcat strike in pursuit of better pay at the Lonmin Platinum Mine. While the terrible spectacle has endured, what is striking is the historical amnesia surrounding the slow violence and slow death that these underclass men and women were fighting against. So in both Nigeria and the US, the police emerge as avatars of state repression and instruments of entrenched class divisions. The police were in public, but did not represent the public good. All this to say that shorn of vested state and capitalist interest, watching police brutality is like watching Hamlet without the Prince of Denmark. My goal here is not to conflate these multiple durays of policing in Nigeria and the US with our here and now experience. Rather, it is to think about the constellation formed by them. It is to show how the non-event of police brutality today, that power of the police to kill without committing homicide, is shot through with the twin legacies of slavery and colonialism and cemented by economic exploitation. This history explains why the police in the US and Nigeria today seem to be caught in a tension between 2 roles. On the one hand, the stated public service role of providing effective security to persons and property, and on the other hand, a post-colonial force for internal repression, applying force to keep the populace subjugated to the interest of a surplus extracting elite. Like the police, the public too are caught in a tension between 2 opposing views. On the one hand is the normative view that sees the police as protectors of the public good. On the other hand is the revisionist view that sees the role of the police as fundamentally to protect the interests of the ruling and propertied class. In my view, this double-charged discourse of the police force coexists, not without tension, within state power itself. We saw this tension in Minneapolis, where in the wake of Floyd's murder and calls to defund and abolish the police, voters rejected a measure to replace the city's police department with a new Department of Public Safety. The city's largest Black neighborhood voted the measure down, signaling their desire for better, not less policing. We also saw this tension during the End SARS campaign when protesters demanded an end to SARS, while also demanding high pay and improved working conditions for members of the police, of the wider police sector. This study was born out of a nagging worry about contemporary debates around policing that tend to disarticulate police brutality, or rather the police itself, from a field of power. I use that Bourdieuian concept to denote a relational mode of thinking, in contradistinction to monolithic and essentialized thinking, one that allows us to grasp at the same time interdependent, rhizomatic, and imbricated assemblages of power and the tensions that inscribe and oppose them. all too often calls for police reform in the wake of yet another spectacle of officer-involved killing, fasting upon the disembedded figure of the police as if it were an island in the world, while occluding the wider matrix of forces such as state and global capitalism that enable and constrain police work. It appears that the crisis of police brutality exists in the vacuum of a collective amnesia, all too common in this new media age, which reduces believing to seeing and downplays the power of the strange and concealed in making sense of the familiar and the visible. Simply put, spectacular police brutality camouflages the true operation of stateness as what Syndicat calls banal terrorism, by which she implies everyday routinized, barely noticed reminders of terror or the threat of an always already presence of terrorism in our midst. The magic of the camera was supposed to better the public's kudai of police work, to furnish us with access to naturally unfolding events, perhaps even to allow us to see like the state after James Scott. But it appears that magic has become our own undoing by occluding our capacity to see behind and beyond the present and the presented, to grasp the surplus of meaning embedded in acts of police brutality. In moments of dramatic police violence, the camera leaves us with an inquest instead of a genealogy. After the French theorist Baudrillard, what we witness through the camera is the submersion of the subject in the spectacle, a submersion that has the inverse effect of heightening the distance from origin. In his opening statement delivered in the trial of former police officer Derek Chauvin, prosecution attorney Jerry Blackwell said this after showing the clip of Floyd's murder. "You can believe your eyes that Floyd's death is homicide. Its murder, you can believe your eyes." Effective as this was, we would need more than believing our eyes to truly fathom and subvert the police brutality complex. For the eyes alone cannot comprehend what the Nigerian musician Fela Kuti calls government magic. Fela should know, on February 18, 1977, his beloved commune, Kalakuta Republic, was razed to the ground by a joint Nigerian police and military operation. Why? Because he had dared to speak out against the military junta. During the raid, Fela's 77-year-old mother, Fumilayo Kuti, a fierce fighter for women and human rights, was thrown from a second-story window and later died from her injuries. A government investigation into the attack claimed the raid was conducted by unknown soldiers. 2 years later, Fela released a song titled Unknown Soldier, in which he described the aftermath of the attack on his Kalakuta commune as government magic, describing the Nigerian police, army, and criminal court system as instruments of that magic. He bellowed in agony. Which kind of injustice is this? A question that haunts today's social movement, such as EndSARS and Black Lives Matter. A question that is now on the hearts and minds of the family of Daunte Wright after last Friday's verdict. In his work on Rethinking the State, the French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu argues that the grip of the state is most palpable in the realm of symbolic production, a realm that constitutes the habitus of, quote unquote, the most brutal relations of force. If the police are the quintessential symbol of the state, then it appears that we have become fixated on that symbol and lost sight of what it gestures towards. Or as they say, we have missed the forest for the trees. As the philosopher theologian Paul Tillich tells us, a symbol always points beyond itself to something unquantifiable and mysterious, revealing the depth dimension of reality itself. Which brings us to the spectral turn. Beyond the terrible spectacle, police brutality points up a spectral state, one that is at once potent and without boundaries, decentered and centralizing, without agency, yet capable of tremendous economic, political, ecological, and planetary effects. Police brutality may be instantly visible and corporeal, but it is vacuous except in association with a state that is ever more captured by capital, ever less bound by the social contract. Treating instances of police brutality as if they were unsullied by state effects and neoliberal rationality produces what I choose to call pseudo-urgency and pseudo-reform. By pseudo-urgency, I mean largely performative actions that really stray far from piecemeal expression of localized shock and awe. But people in the suspect communities are really shocked by police brutality. As the Harvard historian Vincent Brown noted in an interview, "I am a tenured Harvard professor, I am fairly well-to-do, yet I avoid the police whenever I can. I tell my children to avoid the police. I regard the police as I do any other group with weapons, as a potential danger, as if I were going into an encounter with gangsters." By pseudo-reform, I mean technocratic actions such as restructuring police wages, use of body cams, and a ban on chokeholds, the kind that feigns ignorance about what the anthropologist Maria Femme calls the underneath of things. This is why, in my view, the language of police reform remains feckless, because its true intention is not to transform, but rather to perform and to pacify, to gloss over and to explain away. To remake the police after our heart's desire, we need to get better at exposing the secrecy that lies at the core of police power. We need to get smarter at demystifying spectral forces that adversely includes and injuriously exclude, such as those that finance police and penal institutions at the expense of public schools and hospitals, or those that aid and abet reckless practices by multinational corporations to the detriment of local communities who are subjected to bare lives and premature death. Royal Dutch Shell in Nigeria's oil-rich Niger Delta region and Heineken in Burundi, to cite just two. The call here is to disturb the safety that resides in the pretense of invisibility. This really is what lies at the heart of recent calls to end, to defund, to abolish the police in Nigeria and the US, which, when you look deconstructively, are not so much about tearing down as about building up and re-envisioning, as Angela Davis reminds us. In moments of spectacular violence, such as Floyd's murder, the knee-jerk reaction is to channel our anger and frustration towards the police and to demand urgent, concrete, and common sense reform. It is as though the overpowering horror of that brutality and our empathy for the brutalized prevents us from seeing beyond, from situating police brutality where it belongs, within a field of political economy that produces and reproduces modern subjectivity. By reifying the police as a body proper, removed as it were from the body politic, we unwittingly let the state off the hook. We reinscribe state power by sustaining its ghost-like capacity to pass as an ally of the brutalized, when in effect, it is the brutalizer in chief. If the police officer, first and foremost, is a violence worker, as David Correa and Tyler Wall tell us, shouldn't we ask, where is your boss? Deprovincializing police brutality is at heart an invitation to go beyond the thrall of the Debodian society of the spectacle, along with the pathological public sphere that subtends it, by bringing into articulation the society of the spectrum. When it comes to police brutality, we must insist on understanding how the visible and invisible, the real and the ritual interpellate and affect each other, as Zizek urges in his book on violence. We should learn to step back, to disentangle ourselves from the fascinating lure of this directly visible subjective violence, violence performed by a clearly identifiable agent. We need to perceive the contours of the background which generates such outbursts. Herein, I think, lies the real task of deprovincializing police brutality. So taking Nigeria and the US as context in common, this study troubles our tendency to atomize the police, isolated, that is, from the biopolitical and neoliberal rationality that have catalyzed policing from the very start, by treating certain bodies as fungible and disposable, by failing to secure the basic dignities of ordinary existence. It is not a coincidence then that the fundamental site of police brutality is that of ordinariness. Outside a corner store where Floyd was asphyxiated, at a traffic stop where Philando Castile was murdered in a hail of bullets, at a park near his home where 12-year-old Tamir Rice was shot and killed by a police officer, in his grandmother's backyard where Stephen Clark was shot 6 times in the back by a Sacramento police officer, in his father's Florida neighborhood where Trayvon Martin was fatally shot while walking home, on his sofa at home eating ice cream where Botham Jean was shot and killed by an off-duty officer. In Nigeria, as in the US, the everyday roads, checkpoints, bus stops, junctions constitutes the main site of police brutality, harassment, and extortion. These liminal infrastructures and sites embody the contradictions of capitalist modernity, especially its devastating social cost. The typical target of the Nigerian police are people surviving on the margins of society, such as road transport workers, street vendors, car mechanics, and informal traders. In Nigeria, informal transport workers are not uncommonly shot and killed by the police for refusing to pay bribes as low as $1. I read the other day that a commercial bus driver in Lagos set himself ablaze and died in protest against the extortion and seizure of his vehicle by traffic management authorities. The everydayness and therefore the taking for grantedness of police brutality reinforces the point that it is in everyday life that the terrible spectacle of police brutality loses its exceptional character and in the end appears as a normal, ordinary phenomenon. My goal in this study is to deprovincialize police brutality by refracting its ordinariness through a field of power relations that give rise to disposability and death in life. My analysis here is about and beyond necropolitics, a term popularized by the Cameroonian philosopher Achille Mbembe to identify those figures of sovereignty whose central project is the generalized instrumentalization of human existence and the material destruction of human bodies. While necropolitics is now widely cited, it remains, in my view, under-theorized and over-dramatized. To the extent that it trains our eyes on the brutal and bodily destruction, Mbembe's necropolitics is less capacious as a way to go beyond the terrible spectacle of police brutality. Necropolitics too often boils down to a matter of life or death, yet the multitude does not fit easily within this bifurcated world. Thinking with Julia Kristeva's concept of the corpse as the utmost of abjection, as death infecting life, necropolitics may be reconfigured as concerned about who gets locked into the extreme precarity and invariably gets locked outside the juridical order and protections of the state. Necropolitics traps us in what Laurent Belland calls survival time, that cyclical time of struggling, of drowning, of holding onto the ledge, of treading water, of not stopping. Seen in this light, necropolitics is best reimagined with the liminal and abject image of death row, that habitus of the truly condemned. The vast majority of inmates on death row are from over-policed and poor communities, and as a result, they were set up to fail. In the US, the odds of receiving a death sentence are nearly 4 times higher if the defendant is Black than if he or she is white. But it is not just a matter of race, but of class. Too often, said a former death row inmate in Tennessee, the people that are voiceless are the ones that are subjected to the death penalty. The whole time I was there, I have never met nobody or anybody that had money. I have never met a rich person sitting on death row. That class-based discrimination applies as well to Nigeria, which is home to the highest death row population in Africa. Here too, as the Nigerian criminologist Etanebi Alimika explains, the vast majority of persons arrested, charged, remanded, and sentenced are drawn from the poor, powerless, and politically marginalized groups. However, the rich and powerful are often shielded from the full weight of criminal law. The abiding specter of death that haunts, even taunts inmates on death row well describes the precarious lives of people routinely targeted by the police, particularly young Black men. From Black Lives Matter to EndSARS, contemporary protests against police brutality are more than instant reactions to cameos of spectacular police brutality. On the contrary, they are social movements that seek what Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. calls a radical reconstruction of society. They are, in short, social movement against what I choose to call spectral violence. A product of ambivalent state effect, spectral violence describes a violence that is at once here and elsewhere, a violence that hides in plain sight and appears in disguise. In spectral violence, we are dealing with a violence that is tangible and visible, yet secret and distant. The invisible visible, if you will. Spectral violence makes salient what might otherwise remain obscure and barely discernible about police brutality. While we now feel a strong sense of familiarity, even predictability with police brutality, we still know remarkably little about the problem with the problem. That point at which police brutality acquires meaning and becomes teleological. Spectral violence recognizes that the terrible spectacle of police brutality against which people mobilize in their desire for justice remain the mask behind which banal terrorism takes effect. For as Toni Morrison tells us, we can agree, I think, that invisible things are not necessarily not there, that a void may be empty, but it's not a vacuum. Recasting spectacular police violence in a spectral light allows us to do the urgent work of deprovincialization by tracking the ghost-like effects of the state across vast and multiple interacting spaces. In the war on crime that naturalizes certain bodies as criminals, in the prison and oil industrial complexes that causes slow violence and slow death, in the simultaneous embodiment of order and of nightmare that underlies the fetishization of police, in the qualified immunity that makes it awfully hard for the public to charge officers with wrongdoing, in the surplus extracting elite and crony capitalists that eat the sweat of the poor, in the unheard plight of women of color such as Breonna Taylor and Ifeoma Abugu, whose violent death do not quite rise up to grievable and protestable human death, in queer bodies still treated as matter out of place and freighted with fearful fantasies, in global capitalism that undoes the viability of many lives through commodification and social erasure, in the waithood generation, a fancy expression for youth who are stuck between childhood and adulthood, caused by failed neoliberal rationality and bad governance, and of course, in the specter of the undead, the likes of Emmett Till and the Akpo Six, unjustly and untimely killed. Ghosts of yesterday whose footsteps are still heard today in the recent egregious decision by the court to sentence Officer Kim Porter, who shot and killed 20-year-old Dante Wright to just 24 months. A slap on the wrist for sure. In the reluctance of the Nigerian government to name and prosecute officers who brutalized and murdered at least 56 NSAS protesters last fall. Understanding spectral violence is vital to navigating our world today, where increasingly what one cannot see or cannot see clearly determines one's fortunes. In a climate of insecurity and uncertainty, a capacity to see the otherwise invisible has become a strategy of survival. To deprovincialize the police is to bring to the fore the life worlds of the unpeople, those social categories variously disqualified as dangerous, criminal, delinquent, suspicious, disposable, killable, and no humans involved. In the US, African Americans are the quintessential unpeople, as borne out by the dirty wars on crime and drugs. Young Black men in particular constitute the opium of the profligate wars, whose Pyrrhic victories are marked by the contemporary atrocity of mass incarceration. This mutual imbrication of race and prison adheres to a spectral logic. If you don't take my words for it, at least take the contents of this diary entry of President Nixon's former White House Chief of Staff. President Nixon emphasized that you have to face the fact that the whole problem is really the blacks. The key is to devise a system that recognizes this while not appearing to. That spectral logic fits within what Brazilian anthropologist Teresa Caldeira terms the talk of crime, by which she means a talk that, quote unquote, feeds a circle in which fear is both dealt with and reproduced, and violence is both counteracted and magnified. The talk of crime in America today invariably results in police fetishism. That is a celebration of police violence as necessary to control the criminal chaos of everyday life. In her magisterial book, The New Jim Crow, Michelle Alexander argues that nothing has contributed more to the systematic mass incarceration of people of color in America than the war on drugs. 1 in 3 African-American men born today can expect to be incarcerated in their lifetime. Rather stunning when we think of it. In the self-fulfilling nature of America's war on crime, crime itself has become racialized and race criminalized, and both, if I may be forgiven the term, are euthanized. In Nigeria, on the other hand, youth constitutes the main category of the unpeople, as borne out by the country's youth-biased war on cybercrime. The meaning of youth has become so co-opted by criminality in Nigeria that it is almost impossible to imagine one without the other. Today, youth has become a synonym for Yahoo boy, a Nigerian term for internet fraudsters, drawn as it were into the 419 world of Nigerian spectacle. The 419 refers to the article of the Nigerian Criminal Code dealing with fraud. This image of youth as fraud overflows into the global arena in the form of the infamous Nigerian Prince email scam. This banner during the NSAS protest puts the issue clearly: young but not criminal. Starting in the early 2000s, the naturalization of Nigerian youth as lazy and fraudulent became a trademark of SARS' ruthless war on cybercrime. On the basis of their outward appearance and body language, SARS men would accost, shake down, and arrest young Nigerians, especially those with dreadlocks, dyed hair, ripped jeans, earrings, tattoos, iPhones, laptops, and flashy cars. SARS victims who cannot afford to buy their bail are often held incommunicado in overcrowded police cells, with bail is free stickers emblazoned everywhere. In that non-place called police stations, where seized bodies fall outside the purview of human and divine law, youth are stripped, tortured, murdered, and discarded. In 2013, SARS officers in Southeast Nigeria killed and dumped the bodies of 35 young men into the Azu River, contaminating a vital source of water and worship for the local Amsia community. To behold these silent and silenced bodies, this unspeaking and unspeakable violence, is to encounter the omnivorous potentiality of the Nigerian state itself. More than denoting people of African descent, the category of Black or Blackness evokes what Saidiya Hartman calls sins of subjection. This subjection persists despite efforts by scholars and activists to recast Blackness in a more positive and agential light. Nigerians, I should note, tend not to consider themselves Black. In fact, many claim that they were not aware of their Blackness until visiting Euro-America. As the Nigerian writer Chimamanda Adichie noted in a 2018 interview, "I wasn't Black until I came to America. I became Black in America. Growing up in Nigeria, I didn't think about race because I didn't need to think about race." Adichie, however, has no qualms in blaming British colonialism for Nigeria's troubles. Like Adichie and many other Nigerians, I too have grappled with whether Nigerians can lay claim to being Black in the same way that African Americans and Africans who grew up in former settler colonies like South Africa can. At the start of this study, my sense was that I needed to vacate the social category of Black for African Americans and find another frame for Nigerians. To my mind, Nigerians were Nigerians and African Americans were Black. Never mind that Nigeria is the world's largest Black nation. This way of thinking is terribly provincialized and needs to be deprovincialized if we are to have a truly transnational solidarity against police brutality. The truth is that racism was in the DNA of British colonialism in Nigeria. Race and empire danced, as it were, a pas de deux, with economic exploitation providing the classical music. Racism was the necessary condition for the production and maintenance of relations of power, of what Orlando Patterson calls permanent violent domination. Nowhere was this racial impulse more legible than in the bifurcated legal system that required different treatment for natives under the law, a double standard of justice that persists in Nigeria today. That colonial trope of austerity was not only rooted in the Manichaean fantasy of whiteness, white equals good, Black equals bad, but became the very foundation of modern Nigerian subjectivity. Nigerians internalized those twisted lies as a condition of their own existence and striving, reproducing at once the Du Boisian double consciousness of racialized subject. That sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others. Nigerians strive to become white through mastering Queen's English, through relaxing and extending their natural kinky hair, visiting the white man's land, or Obodo-Yibo as they say, and applying skin lightening products. To this day, fair skin remains a key social marker of beauty and economic privilege in Nigeria. Incredibly, 77% of women in Nigeria today use skin bleaching products, the world's highest percentage. So in truth, Adichie did not need the US to pique her interest in race. Britain already racialized Nigerians as Black as the sign of a lack. That raised coloniality is alive and well in the downright criminalization of youth by a Nigerian state that is blind to their personhood and apathetic to their death. What we see here is the ambivalent complicity of Black people as simultaneously victim and perpetrator in ensuring that Black lives don't always matter. As the Indian author Arundhati Roy reminds us, once you get used to not seeing something, then slowly it's no longer possible to see it. Regarded in this light then, to claim, as some have, that the killing, torture, and maiming of scores of Nigerian youth by their own police is non-racial, since Nigeria is a monoracial nation, it's not unlike saying that the shooting of an unarmed Black youth by a Black cop could not possibly be raised, since the cop is Black. In my view, both instances have less to do with the pathology of individual cops and more to do with a post-colonial state that venerates the logic of the market and strips away the things that make us human, at least some of us. And yes, the US is a post-colonial state. Social movements such as Black Lives Matter and EndSARS know that they are not simply fighting against the terrible spectacle of police brutality, but are locked in a far more complex struggle to identify and disarm the twin spectre of state violence and racial capitalism. Yes, Black Lives Matter originated in response to the shooting of Black teenager Trayvon Martin in 2012, especially after the acquittal of his killer, George Zimmerman, a volunteer in a neighborhood watch program that was run by a local police department. And EndSARS first trended in 2017, following a police-involved murder that went viral. Yet in the coming years, both campaigns recalibrated their protest agendas by refracting their original movement against police brutality through what the Black historian Evelyn Higginbottom calls a meta-language, which she defined as a fluid set of overlapping and dialogic discourses, and as a global sign that gives power to a host of expressions and to myriad aspects of life. This meta-language was on full display in Nigeria when calls by young protesters to end SARS and end police brutality quickly morphed into broader demands to end bad governance, end corruption, stop killing our youth, end state violence. In similar vein, after Trayvon Martin, Black Lives Matter made an appreciable effort to reconfigure spectacular instances of police brutality as symptoms of structural injustice and social ills that are spectral in nature, such as the invisible, visible disparities present in housing, public education, justice, and healthcare systems. They realized that highly visible instances of police brutality, from Michael Brown to Sandra Bland and Philando Castile, have served to call public attention to the disproportionate targeting of Black lives by the police. Yet, the ways in which the criminal justice system operates to disadvantage Black and brown bodies are systemic and ingrained, and often more subtle. Black Lives Matter activists came to question why Black neighborhoods get police, not public policy, and prisons, not public schools. As Opal Tometi, the Nigerian American co-founder of Black Lives Matter, notes in this statement, we recognize the current struggle is not merely for reforms of policing any more than the Montgomery bus boycott was simply about a seat on the bus. It is about the full recognition of our rights as citizens, and it is a battle for full civil, social, political, legal, economic, and cultural rights of Black people in the US, which is also tied to Black people's struggle for human rights across the globe. If today's social movements, from EndSARS to Black Lives Matter, ever expect to overcome police brutality, then they must transcend monolithic, nationalist, and essentialized renderings of police brutality, and instead adopt a deconstructive logic that puts the terrible spectacle of police brutality in overlapping and dialogic exchange with the state and global capitalism. This means becoming fluent in a meta-language that inscribes police, state, and racial capitalism within the same episteme. In both Nigeria and America, young Black men are the essential markers of crime and danger, and as you would expect, the prime suspects. Across police cells in Nigeria, young men constitute the overwhelming majority of detainees, reinforcing the male-biased nature of crime cleanups. In his book, Chokehold, Paul Butler argues that a stop in America is really a masculinity contest between you and the police. You must let the cop win. The zeal of the police in Nigeria and the US for dominating young Black men, for showing them who is boss, derives in huge measure from the power and the spectacle of the phallus, which has been the focus of constructing masculinity and the state from the very beginning. Black women are also violently targeted by the police, but their plight is too often rendered less visible and less important vis-a-vis their similarly situated male counterparts. Offering a tragic reminder is 28-year-old Ifeoma Abugu, a Nigerian university graduate who was raped and murdered by SARS officers as it happens on 9/11/2020. Abugu's autopsy showed that she died from asphyxiation, contradicting initial police claims that she died from cocaine overdose. Another case is that of 26-year-old Breonna Taylor, a Black medical worker who was shot dead while sleeping in her own apartment in 2020 by Louisville police officers. And while Black men disproportionately die by police violence, in many cases it is Black women who are forced to live through it. In this way, Black women experience police violence not just subjectively, but also intersubjectively as mothers, wives, girlfriends, daughters, passengers, and widows. It is they who bear witness to and against police brutality. This is the final slide and final part of the presentation. Why the US and Nigeria? Because they outperform most other countries in matters of police brutality, and because at the same time, the police in both countries enjoy near legal and political impunity. Police in Nigeria and America kill no less than 1,000 people annually, most of which begin with enforced traffic stops and other non-violent offenses. Data on police brutality in Nigeria is deliberately sparse. As far as we know, between 2000 and 2007, police in Nigeria shot and killed at least 10,000 people, which averages to about 1,400 victims annually. In 2020, more Nigerians died of police brutality than of coronavirus pandemic. On the other hand, US police killed more people in the first 24 days of 2015 than police did in England and Wales combined over the previous 24 years. I read recently that in Norway, the police have not killed anyone in 10 years. Many cases of police brutality in Nigeria and the US go unprosecuted precisely because of the police's privileged status as incarnations of the sovereign right to kill and instruments of government magic, a magic best conjured by the contentious doctrine of, in Nigeria, sovereign immunity, and in the US, qualified immunity. Out of 1,944 killings of Black people in America from 2013 to 2019, charges were brought against police officers in 3% of cases. Fewer than 1% of the killings reached a conviction. In his Arrow of God, Nigerian author Chinua Achebe sums it up in his usual proverbial style. When we see a little bird dancing in the middle of the pathway, we must know that its drummer is in the nearby bush. In Nigeria, citizens unlawfully killed by the police are usually explained away as armed robbers who were shot and killed while trying to escape, somehow implying that brutal policing can be enacted through a simulacrum of danger and order. Since the apogee of armed robbery cases in Nigeria in the 1980s, the term armed robber has become a leitmotif in police rationalization of extrajudicial killings. In the US, by comparison, prosecutors often tap into that hidden transcript about Black folks as drug addicts to get away with murder. For example, prosecutors justified the police killing of Michael Brown by arguing that the marijuana found in his system had caused him to become violent. Officer Geronimo Yanes, who shot and killed Philando Castillo, claimed that the smell of marijuana made him fear for his life. Police serving a no-knock drug warrant on the wrong house fatally shot Breonna Taylor. The officers who ganged up on Floyd reported that he appeared to be under the influence. Lethal labels such as armed robber and drug addict register an all too familiar police logic that blames the poor for their misfortune and death, that defines the poor as somehow deserving of brutal punishment. These are just two of many lethal labels that constitute what Korean War have termed cop speak, a language of policing that normalizes the institution of police as a necessary evil, as the last line of defense against a world forever threatening to fall apart. In the US and Nigeria, militarized policing was wielded to quell peaceful protest against police brutality in 2020. That summer, US police used rubber bullets and tear gas to disperse furious Black Lives Matter protesters. Close to 20,000 National Guard troops were deployed to put down the uprising. At the time, more soldiers than occupied Iraq and Afghanistan. Thousands of Black Lives Matter protesters were arrested and 12 people, mostly African-American men, were killed. Emboldened by the US, Nigeria raised the bar later that fall when the police and army fired live bullets into a peaceful assembly of NSAS protesters in Lagos, who at the time were singing, dancing, and waving their national flag in what may be described as a festival of the oppressed. Lastly, decades of police reforms have only succeeded in remilitarizing the police and expanding its inroads into suspect communities, evincing what Alan Silver has termed a policed society. By deprovincializing police brutality in two nations that rarely share the same stage, my goal is to show the interpenetration of the spectacular and the spectral, that relationship between the on display and the off stage of police work and police talk. My hope is to provoke a truly transnational solidarity against police brutality. By solidarity here, I do not assume that the struggles of Black Lives Matter and NSAS are one and the same thing, or that their pain is the same pain, or that their hope for the future is coterminous. Instead, after the feminist scholar Sarah Mead, my aim is to recognize that even though we do not have the same feelings, or the same lives, or the same bodies, we do live on common ground. We do dwell in what Dr. King has called the larger world house. Above all else, we do draw collective breath. And as Mbembe reminded us recently, that breath in common is a universal right. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Daniel, for such a rich talk. God, I loved how thoroughly comparative it was, both in terms of at the conceptual level, at the historical level, and then the way you ended at the end by giving us, these concrete statistics. So it was just for that alone, how to do comparative studies on all these different registers. It was so rich. Now, I know we're running out of time, but it would be great maybe if you don't mind entertaining just a couple of questions. So some you've answered, if not directly, suggestively through your talk. So I'm reading the questions that have been posted on in the Q&A tab. So one attendee asks, says, this has been fascinating. What are the ethnic dimensions to police brutality in Sub-Saharan Africa? It's a very diverse continent. This question was raised midway through your talk, and I loved how you delay that question about race in an all-Black country or a monoracial country like Nigeria, whether race exists. You tended to that. And maybe I'll ask a couple of them together so you can maybe see answer them together. There's another related question. Is there some commonality across countries with regard to how the police function? Well, slightly different question. So, if the ultimate purpose or the instrument of oppression in a divisive state, if it's the police, then is the real question about more, not about the police per se, but the state and its relationship to its citizen. So maybe if you can attend to those questions.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. And those are all very useful questions. The ethnic dimension to policing has been I guess most policing in Nigeria has been studied actually from that sort of ethno-religious dimension, but I would argue that it is not significant, perhaps because of the centralized nature of policing in Nigeria. But I would argue that issues of class in the broader sense are perhaps more dominant when it comes to the policing. I'm not saying that is not important, but I think I would say that issues, they often are subsumed under issues of class. Obviously, I've done a lot of work with transport operators, and I've seen situations where someone from a similar background or ethnic group can get away with less bribes or no bribes with the police and find their way out of it. But I think when you talk to ordinary Nigerians, you quickly find out that the feeling of the police as being a brutal force is quite shared across both majority and minority ethnic groups. And so that does not emerge as particularly significant. But that might, I'm saying that, and this goes into the second question as well about the commonality of policing. I would imagine that a place like Kenya, in a country like Kenya, that is particularly important. So we might see, so it's not a case of being included or excluded. It's just a case of which one has a higher significance when it comes to analyzing the police. But I think in Nigeria that wasn't the case. I think in terms of commonality of policing across Africa, I think there are like in every comparative cases, there are things that are unique, but there's a lot that is shared in common. I think if you talk to many Africans, even if you look at the Afrobarometer, you quickly realize that there's a shared feeling of dissatisfaction when it comes with the way in which the police interacts with the public. And we saw that in the wake of George Floyd, that there were protests in Nairobi, there were protests in South Africa. Many of these protests were they had a double face. They were both empathetic towards what was going on in the US, but that also invited a sort of introspective question about what is happening here in the country. And what I'm describing here in Nigeria, if you look at a country like Kenya or Uganda, you see very similar things. Was it 2015 when Kenya went up in protest against the death squads after certain bodies were found in the river who were killed by the police. A lawyer, his driver, his team were just literally just wiped out by the police, and that raised a lot of questions around police brutality. So I think there's a shared, at the emotional level, at the feeling level, there's a shared. I think most Africans from other parts of the continent would recognize what I'm presenting here and would be able to personalize it in ways that are both shared but also unique. I think the last question, I didn't quite get it. It was a bit about the police-public relations.
More in general, I guess. How about this? Maybe there's another question that's come up that maybe addresses that, and I think more it's about the kind of the state and its different instruments, right, of violence and how that mediates its citizens. So the question of what's happening with the police is a reflection of, a larger conundrum that we seem to face about the state. Yeah. But here's the question I think dovetails to it. So it says that of course, thank you for the excellent talk. It says your analysis of Nigeria fits nicely with those of us doing solidarity work against anti-Black genocide in the United States and Brazil and the broader America, such as Colombia. What are the commonalities that you perceive in relationship to urban development and gentrification, the modernization of cities, kind of class stratification of cities, and policing?
Yeah, and I think I'll tie that point to the last point you made as well about how the police can be a lens through which we can understand multiple aspects of crisis in everyday life. I would say that when I was in the process of working on this paper, and I'm still in the early phase of this project, I have been quite inspired by the work of scholars like Teresa Caldeira in Brazil, where she's worked on, you know, in the slums in Brazil, and she's looked at ways in which entrenched class divisions plays out in a very special way, in which the rich and the wealthy are literally withdrawing from the center of the city to the margins of the city, and creating their own private security police. And I thought that resonated so powerfully with what is happening in Nigeria, where 40% of the Nigerian police force are assigned to private individuals, elites who they do their bidding. So really, and that tracks back as well to the role of the police. The role of the police, the normative role of the police has been instruments of the state. So you can see ways in which these are connected in very powerful ways. And I'm sure it's the same thing as well in Colombia. You can only think about even the whole concept of community policing as well, that probably features prominently in a place like Colombia, non-state actors, and look at the relationship they have with the police, in ways in which we need to move beyond the narrative of weak or fragile states that is often dominating the literature, and begin to look at the strength of weak states, the way in which these states are able to sort of cooperate and conflict with these actors are very interested in it. And that goes back to what Timothy Mitchell was talking about, the blood boundaries of the state. And you think about in Bolivia as well, Daniel Goldstein has talked about the ways in which the state is there and not there, and constantly in interaction with all these multiple spheres of daily life. So I think the police offers a window into understanding multiple interacting crises in everyday life.
Great, fantastic. Well, there's a comment, and maybe I'll take the liberty to ask the last question since we're out of time. So the comment is, to underscore your point, someone posted, well, Black police everywhere in a majority Black country or not can internalize the values of a racist, state and become the state's instrument of oppression, which I think underlines your point. I guess my question is, if you think about, case in Nigeria, case in my native Ethiopia, of, in the kind of post-colonial phase, you had kind of military, these authoritarian rule, but military dictators, right? So hand in the hand of the military. And so the way in which, for instance, policing works in Ethiopia is that the difference between, say, the police, the military police, the military, right? You have such an elaborate scheme of administering violence, and that came out of the military junta framework. And so I'm wondering if that factors in your thinking.
Absolutely. I think the whole the relationship between the military and the police is fascinating. Even in the US here, that has waged a lot of wars outside the US, and those wars have actually shaped the police and how the police is structured. And so there's vast literature on militarization of police. But more to your point in terms of Ethiopia and Nigeria, think about Nigeria, for example. The police, well, for most of Nigeria's history, it's been dominated by militarized rule. And during those period, in the early period, in the late 60s, early 70s, the military actually saw the police as a threat, because at independence, the police outnumbered the military. So this was a threat. So there was a deliberate starvation of police in terms of financial resources, in terms of training and the rest, to undermine the police. But what we've also seen as well is more recently the remilitarization of the police. And this is partly because of the war on terror in northeastern Nigeria and the war against oil militants in the southeast of the country. And those wars have sort of blurred the boundaries between the police and the military in such a way then that you no longer talk about the police and the military, you talk about joint task force, whatever that means. There's almost a joint task force, joint military task force that involves the Air Force, the police, the military, and the lines are blurred, and they are in almost all the states in Nigeria at the moment. So that blurring of that distinction that you're talking about there in Ethiopia is something that is actually quite visible in Nigeria. And I think it is, we can trace we can explain it in light of some of the wars that have taken place in the country, but also when you look at the US here as well, you think about how many Nigerian police personnel come to places like Virginia to train. And to, the US is still doling out training to Nigerian personnel, and that is itself somewhat problematic as well in terms of what is going on in those training, what weapons are exchanging hands. Under Trump, there were a lot of weapons that were sort of sent to Nigeria that these guys are fighting the war on terror that made their way into the hands of the police. So these are some of the unknowns that need to be opened up. We need to expose that. And part of what I want to do is to begin to do that sort of looking at the training system that is happening, that US is giving out to Nigerian police force, and looking at what are the content of that to the extent that I can see that, because these are often very deliberately mystified. But that is happening. And so I think it's no coincidence that Ethiopia, Nigeria, and the US are countries that in recent years have actually been fighting one war or the other. And war, I think, blurs that line between the police and the military. And we see the militarization of policing is really what Alan Silver was talking about, the police society, the expansion of the police into spaces that are seen as enemy zones, enemies of the state. This is what is happening really. And so we're seeing that especially, and that's something that I hope that I can explore further in the course of this work.
Okay, so we were slated to end at 6:30, but so there's some comments, some questions. And I don't want to anyone to take offense or slight, but we do have to end. But one last question, Daniel, just came in. So there's a question that says, it would seem to me particularly illustrative. Well, first, thank you for your excellent talk. And then said, it would seem to me particularly illustrative parallel in the sphere of criminal injustice between the US and Nigeria is in the police of pretrial detention. I would be very interested to hear your thoughts on how pretrial detention and bail practices, which many ways criminalize the accused and disproportionately harm the same members of society most police are harmed by, figure into your framework of spectral violence and euthanization.
No, that's an excellent question, and it's something that I've just noted that is something that I would be really interested in exploring further. And I actually do have a chapter in what will be a book called the Prison and Oil Industrial Complexes. And I think one of the things that I want to explore in that is really this point that you're raising there about this pretrial cases and the spectrality of it as well. And so that is a great question that I would take into that chapter in terms of thinking through it.
Well, fantastic. Thank you so much, Daniel, again, for such a rich talk. And as I said earlier, how to do kind of comparative studies, how to do Africana studies, how to do African studies, and again, conceptually, but also it's something that's so pressing and immediate in our lives and of grave consequence. So we thank you. I also want to thank our audience for joining us this evening. We hope you will join us for future Africa lecture series. talks, as well as our other programs this semester. Please visit the Center for Africana Studies' website for program details and registration information. Again, thank you so much, and have a great evening, everyone.
Thank you very much.